Well, Cami, here we are, the Confident Grief Coach Show. And one of our first discussions that we wanted to have a chat about is coming up on its February 4th, is World Cancer Day. And you and I were talking a little bit about the grief that arises from someone who is diagnosed with cancer, the anticipatory grief that comes with that, kind of the grief that shows up when our person dies, and also how grief can actually impact the physical body, and some of the people that we've known who actually have said, hey, this cancer came from a grief event. So let's just dive right in. So let's talk a little bit about anticipatory grief. You have your own stories. So do you want to just share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I'm very familiar with anticipatory grief. Both of my big losses, my dad and my stepdad were sick leading up to it. So, with my dad, he didn't have cancer, but he had another degenerative disease where I watched him become sick until he died. And then after that was my stepdad who had prostate cancer. And that was interesting for me being, I think I was 12 when my mom married my stepdad, knowing that he had prostate cancer. So, having just lost my dad at 11 years old, I had this like new dad in my life that we knew was sick. So, that was like really exciting and celebratory to have this wedding and this love and this new family. And at the same time, it was like, okay, here we go again. Like, fingers crossed that, like, obviously, we have our time with him. So, that had a lot of mixed emotions for me. And he was obviously in treatment and receiving the surgeries and the radiation and all of that. And and eventually the doctors told him, okay, we've done all we can. You're going to die in 6 months. Good
Oh
luck.
gosh. Oh,
And yeah, it was like at that moment, we were like, okay, what else can we do? We had just gone through years of this treatment and obviously just had this fresh new life with this new family that we were so excited about. So being a kid through all of that was like really emotional for me. I felt kind of helpless. Like I couldn't really do anything. I was just seeing him, go off to his appointments and go off to the treatments. And my mom was working, and all I had to do was just go to school. So that was scary for me, feeling so helpless with all of that and watching him progressively get sicker and sicker. And then when the doctors told him that he would die within 6 months, my family decided to try on some alternative complementary treatments, basically pumping his veins full of vitamins and doing coffee enemas and using
wow.
food as medicine and all of that good
Yep.
stuff. And he ended up living for almost 5 years.
Wow, that's amazing.
So when we went back to the doctor, they were like, "You're supposed to be dead." So that was like there was just like so many ups and downs of like, wow, you're sick. We know that your time is coming. Yet we're gonna do everything that we can. We have hope and we have time still, even if it was just an extra few years together. That was a blessing to us to have our family for that extra time.
That's amazing. That's amazing. My story is very different in that my dad, I think he knew probably like a year or so before, because he kept saying, I'm not going to be around next year. And I'm like, don't say that. But I didn't, because I saw him every day, I didn't see deterioration with him. But he had some chronic issues that we would go to the doctor and they just really didn't pay a lot of attention to. My dad had had a stroke. He was only in his late 60s, had had a stroke, and it left him aphakic. So he couldn't really talk. And, he looked like a much older man than what he was because of his inability to have a good gait and that type of thing. So finally, he got to see another doctor, who was actually the ex-wife of his regular doctor. And I took him in for a blood test, a typical one that he had every month. And she said, you've lost 20 pounds in the last year. And I went, there is no way he lost 20 pounds. He moved in with us because my grandmother died, so he wasn't living at that house anymore. And I said, he eats like voraciously. He's
Mhm.
eating all the time. So I don't understand how he could have lost 20 pounds. And she said, I think we need to see what's going on here. So that raised the flag, like maybe there's something not here. So he went in for exploratory surgery. in 1990. So it's been 34 years ago. And I believe the surgery was on January 24th. So we just went through an anniversary of the actual surgery. And then he went home, and within 3 weeks of diagnosis, he was metastatic colon cancer. And he just chose, he said, I don't want to have treatment. And I said, okay, you can come home with us. Are you sure? Absolutely. So we called hospice, and within 3 weeks, he passed. And I
Wow.
believe that he passed because I had to go back to work. I had, back in the day, I only had so much FMLA or whatever. And so I was going to have my niece come in and start caring for him while I was at work. And it feels like he just chose to make his leave so that we didn't have to go through all of that. So, but it was so rapid. So it was hard to wrap my head around it.
Mhm. Yeah, you had 3 weeks after finding out that it was cancer before he moved in and got on hospice and then passed all within
Three
less than a month.
weeks. Yep, less
Wow.
than a month.
So what was that? I mean, that's totally different from my experience having this drawn out over the course of years. What was that like to like hear the news and then to just have things like boom, boom, boom? Like, how was that like from a grief perspective going through all of that?
I think I would just went into nurse mode. I'm a registered no, I think I just went into nurse mode and caregiver mode. But I was able to have really strong conversations with him, like very poignant. Like, Dad, are you sure? And when I brought him home from the hospital after the surgery, his temp spiked to like 102 point something, and he was like burning up. And I said, Dad, are you sure? And he goes, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. And I said, okay, so you just need to know that we're going to probably have some of these situations, you know, as you're going through this process. And he's like, that's fine. I don't want to go to the hospital. And I said, okay, I honor that. And so it really was about, having those. I didn't realize that he was going to go that fast, but the deterioration happened pretty rapidly. And it was great because we were able to have those conversations of what his wishes were. But one thing about my dad, that he was very intuitive, I think. I would bet 5 years before that, when this wasn't even in our mind's eye, he made me sit down with a representative who came that had insurance for burials and funerals. It was like an insurance policy. And I remember us sitting down, and we even went and chose, no, we didn't go choose the casket, but my grandmother had died earlier, like about a year and a half earlier than him. And when I went with him to go choose her casket, he's like, when I die, I want the cheapest thing you can find. Do not spend a lot of money on this. And this was
Mm,
before people did a lot of the cremation and that type of thing. So I knew going into it, and when he died, what exactly I needed to do. So I had kind of a checklist, and that
mm,
helped me go through this process. So I don't know that I really was grieving, that I was aware of.
it was more like, okay, these are the things I got to do. We have a lot to prepare for since you made this decision. We got this news. I'm putting my nurse hat on, and you just did all the things.
Yep. And I don't think the grief hit probably for a year after, truly, because I had a little child. I was separating from my husband. So there was all this extraneous stuff going on. And I honestly don't, I just went in life. So I kind of, what someone had said, I had a student in one of our classes one time going, oh, you do your grief. People do their grief. And it's like, I did my grief. I was action oriented in it
Mm,
till about a year after. Then all of a sudden it just like hit. And I had to have some of those sobbing moments, and guilt moments and all those different things. But I just have to say, my dad was an easy transition.
mm,
He knew what he wanted, and I knew what he wanted, so that was easy. So how about you, with Greg?
mhm.
And because you didn't know, talk to me a little bit about, what was that anticipatory grieving like for you and your family?
Yeah. There are so many layers with that. And I'm glad you brought up like end of life planning, because I think that was an important part of preparing for Greg's transition and making that passing like really sacred for him and for our family, which was a contrast to my dad's death. So that was all being talked about. We kind of, as those days neared and we could tell he was getting really sick, we had some of those things in place, which made, I think, the grief and preparing for it, like, of course you're still upset and there's all the emotions and everything that come with all of that, but it was like, okay, we have a plan. At least we know what we want it to look like. It's just then waiting for that time to come, which is like, whew, like anxiety. It's interesting now, years later, after he passed, I feel in my body the anxiety approaching both my dad and my stepdad's death dates,
Mm.
because it's like, it's coming, it's coming, and you're just like, is it today? Is it today? And every day you wake up, it's just like that's in the back of your mind. So I feel still, after all these years, anxiety in my body as the death dates approach. So that was like, yeah, a big experience with the anticipatory grief for me, was this anxiety, like clenching, holding, like holding your breath, waiting for that moment, for that day to come, because you know that it's on its way. And being a kid, this was especially challenging for me, because now that I'm learning about, just brains and how they develop, I had internalized a lot of self-worth, from my perception that Greg was choosing to leave.
Mm.
Um, he came home from his last blood transfusion, and near the end, the transfusions were the only thing keeping him alive. They were, of course, giving him that life force energy through the blood transfusions. And he came home one day and he was like, doing that anymore. That was my last treatment. He walked through the door and basically announced that. And I don't remember this, but my mom said that I fell to my knees and was just like sobbing, because it was like we knew that it would happen. Like any day after that, because he had to go in every 3 days for the transfusions. So after that, he decided, of course, he wanted to die at home. And we got all the family over. We had a big party for him, and he had like no energy at that point. So it only lasted like an hour or two, but everyone got to say goodbye. And that next morning, that early morning at like 5 a.m., he died. So that was when, like, I mean, he got his last hurrah with his family, and we had all the things in order as far as how he wanted his death to look like. And that morning, I got woken up from my mom. I was downstairs and she said, it's time. It's like, oh God. So I was like 15 years old, laying in my bed downstairs, like, I don't want to go up there.
Mm.
I don't want to go upstairs. I don't want this to happen. I laid in bed for like an hour before I finally got the nerves to like go upstairs. And by that point, my family was surrounding him in bed. And of course, he was unconscious, and his breathing was already like coming and going in kind of a weird pattern. And we had music playing and everyone was holding hands. It was really beautiful, but it was like, oh God, here it is. Like,
Yep.
just so much anxiety and emotions. And yeah, I was very much was not a do griever. I was like in it, crying, sobbing, feeling, processing all of that, but at the same time not wanting to be here for it at all,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to check out, wanting to go sleep it off. And then every day that I woke up after that, it was like you forget for a split moment that it happened, and then it's like boom, you remember, and it's like, oh my God, no, I don't want to be here for the day. I don't want to like try to figure this out. So I think the anticipatory grief for me manifested more as anxiety. And then after the grief, after the death happened, of orienting to life now without your person, was like way more depressive, unmotivated, like just worn down by all of it. Now that that release finally happened, it was like, wow, now what? So
Well, I think too, as you're talking, I think about, I volunteered at, it started as a children's grief camp. Now it's a family camp. You've done the same. And when we take a look at children and developmental levels, so you were 15 going through this, which is a highly charged age anyway, with confusions and all of that as 15-year-olds. I was in my early 30s. So, and I had some life experiences, not a parent, but definitely, and being a nurse, that I probably could go into and compartmentalize
Mm.
and go into nurse mode. Whereas if I was 50, I can just imagine, and that's something that I think for us, especially as grief coaches and when we're working with families and parents and that type of thing, is to help them. I think that when we help the parents or the adults, we're in turn helping their children, because as the adults can, process in their grief and have healthy ways, but also being free to show the emotions is very, it's a wonderful thing, because it can be a whole family approach.
Yeah.
You,
Yeah.
can I just say, you talked about like a lot of kind of some of the planning and things like that. And as you were talking, something came to me. I was just meeting with someone who's going to join the Confident Grief Coach certification program in April. And her mother was utilized death with dignity, and she was a physician, family practice, and then went on to do some really great things. And she really fought to bring some of that legislation. So I know that there's a lot in the United States, I know across Canada now has that option, dying with dignity or death with dignity, where you can choose your death date, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's several states in the US, but then there are not a lot. But I just wanted to ask you, like, you've gone through doula training, you've had all of that, you've had your lived experiences. How might you think like death with dignity might actually support a family such as yours, like with Greg? Was that kind of a similar path, even though it wasn't giving an injection or something? Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter how the ending is happening, whether it's chosen, on this date and this time, I prefer to do it then, or if you're gonna wait it out and just let the natural course of the disease or whatever's happening to unfold. I think the important part is that we're thinking about it and we're having the conversations and we are planning accordingly. Because all too often we don't think about it. We're desperately trying to save someone's life. And then what ends up happening is they're in the hospital receiving invasive treatments that are lowering their quality of life, making their time that they have left really, stuck in a hospital room, tied up to all these tubes and receiving surgeries and all these things that in reality are not going to save their life. Yet the doctors also need to learn how to have those conversations with the clients. At what point is it like, really not going to help anymore? Do you want to just go home and be with your family? How do you want your last days, your time to really look like? Or do you want to fight and do everything you possibly can and be in the hospital and be okay with how that is going at the end of life? So I think just like having those conversations and being really honest is the most important part. And then from there, that's where the dignity comes from, is like, this is my choice. It's not like, I think so many people think that they don't have a choice. It's like, next thing that they know, they're dead in the hospital and they really didn't even think about how they wanted their death to go, this sacred transition. Who do you want to be there? What do you need to say? How do you want the environment to feel like? And those things I think just can make that experience for the griever and for the person who's dying so much more supportive and magical and sacred when we can be really present and intentional with the process.
Well, and as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, you and I and the people that are in our community, we're passionate about, we need to talk about death and dying. We can't sweep it under the rug. We can't, not talk about it like it's a dirty word. It is so important because it is part of life. And for me and for you, you were at a different age, but it's like we were able to have these conversations with our loved one. And so for me, there was no question about dad, and, providing him the morphine that he needed and allowing him to go in the way that he chose to go, right? Whereas if you never had those conversations, that's a very, very, to put that on your shoulders could probably really impact the grief journey, because then the guilt, like, did I make the right decision? Oh my gosh, what if they wanted to stay? Or there's people that like, I want to hang on, I don't care. But yet, that the person, from me, from the nursing perspective and having been around a lot of people in death and dying, to keep someone there for us is a really challenging thing to put on the shoulders of someone who's dying. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the things I was thinking about is you're all about embodied grief support, right? And I just shared with you earlier, it just popped into my head that there was someone who actually took our course. She was like in the very first Confident Grief Coach certification course. But I knew her back in the day. I actually met her at Children's Grief Camp. She and her sons used to go there every so often. And when she was in her 50s, probably her early 50s, she came to me and she said, I need to talk to you. And she had symptoms and she said, I need to go to the doctor. And she was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. And so she asked me if I would go with her to her first radiology, where they were like going to figure out all this stuff, because I was kind of a safe person, because I wasn't like a close, intimate friend,
Sure.
but I was a safe space. But she always would say to me, Pat, I know that this came because my husband died when my kids were just littles. They were like 2 and 3 or 2 and 4 years old. And she said that grief that I had been holding all these years, and being a single parent, and the grief that my husband died tragically, and here I was, she said, I know that's where the tumor came from.
Wow.
So it's not even the cancer. When we talk about cancer and World Cancer Day and that type of thing, it's not even just about the person who we're grieving in that anticipatory grief and in the death and dying process, but also how cancer can impact us physically when we have a huge grief event. So what are your thoughts on that, being an embodiment coach, and all the knowledge that you have regarding that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like thinking about obviously the people that we know that we've been impacted by, like who have died from cancer, yet also zooming out and thinking about like where does cancer really come from? And there's like so many answers to that question. Yet I think one thing that I want to normalize talking about is grief and emotions and how that can get stuck in your body. That emotional energy that we don't know how to process and work through very much can get lodged in our body and manifest in our physical tissues. And especially if it's, a chronic thing that we're dealing with, then that's our body's way of communicating to us, hey, you need to take care of this. There's something going on internally that, of course, there's so many, it could be an environmental factor, there could be, genes involved, or what if it was from the stresses and the experiences of your life that we don't have the skills to work through and we don't have the skills to process in a healthy way. So then they just live within us and just get bottled up until they turn into cancer or a chronic disease or some other kind of like manifestation that impacts our life and our health. So for me, I love to normalize that and to get people to think about how do your emotions and grief and our inability to process things affect our health and well-being. And for me, I experienced that firsthand with anxiety and depression and panic attacks. I had literally had acne all over my face, and I tried everything physically to deal with it. And it did not go away until I started processing my grief. And
Mm.
then it was like, boom, these symptoms started to fall away the minute that I gave myself permission to feel into all the things that I had been carrying and to cry it out, to move it out, scream it out, kick it out, talk with someone about it. Like that is when I started to really feel the relief. And I think that's important in our society where we don't know how to be present for grief. We don't know how to support people through this process and these big, heavy things that we'd rather just ignore. Yet it goes to show like we need to, because if we don't, then it's like that grief just gets stored within our body, and then it affects us in so many different ways.
Yep, yep. And we talk about like the ancient Chinese theory of the five element theory, and this was I learned through Master Chunyi Lin, who I worked for and learned Qigong, but that depression and the crying and the deep grief can settle in our lungs, right? And so that's why we have the breathe coaching model for grief. And then you've taken that and integrated it with the embodiment support. And I think, that's one of the key things when we talk about, mind, body, and spirit. There's physical things that we really encourage clients to lean into, right? So whether it's having about someone that, like yourself, who does body work, cranial sacral therapy, you teach yoga, all of those are things, I love qigong. I do yoga myself, all of those things help us get into that feeling. I thought someone had mentioned to me that they went to yoga, they tried it for the first time and they just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed on their mat. And then they thought, well, I don't think I should go again, because
Mm,
it just, all the emotions came through of their grief. I don't think I should go again. And I'm like, no, your yoga mat is your personal space.
yeah,
How beautiful. And if that's the one that allows you to just release and feel
yeah.
and do all of it, that is the healthiest thing you can possibly do. So yeah, I just yeah, a
I love
lot.
what you said about the Chinese five element theory and how, like, I mean, in Chinese medicine, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on that kind of stuff, but like with our meridians, our meridians are this energy flow that moves through our body, and it travels through different organ systems at different times of the day, and within those organ systems also has associated emotions.
Yep.
So if we're struggling physically with some system in our body, let's say our kidneys are we're having some issue with our kidneys or with our adrenals and stress hormones and things like that, then in Chinese medicine, that they would look at emotionally what might be blocked. And
Hmm.
I think kidneys have to do with fear.
Hmm.
So thinking about, okay, well then what is that about? What fear can I explore? What fear have I not faced that is causing this energetic blockage that's manifesting in my kidneys? So just thinking about those relationships more as a holistic approach to
Yep.
really supporting your grief and your life experience, and just all of the things that we go through as human beings. These
Yep.
crazy experiences that we all get to have, just working with all of that as a connected whole being, on all the levels. So I think that's
Yep.
fascinating.
And I think all emotions are okay, right? People say, oh, then it's hard to say the negative emotions. I call them the challenging ones, right?
Mm.
You know, but those emotions are so necessary, and to bottle them up. And that you're the prime example. That's, you kind of stuffed it in, and it started showing up in your skin, and and other things, and all of that type of thing, where, if we are able to express it. And so I just want to go back to, we're the confident grief coaches, right? And this is why we went into grief coaching, is so that we can hold the space, allow the emotions to be witnessed, and then help clients go tap into themselves to determine, okay, what can I do to move forward?
Mm,
But not to block the emotions, not to stuff them down, but to feel that whole experience and walk away with, after a session, in the session, like, okay, this is one thing I can do, right? I can go have a cranial sacral therapy appointment, right? I can go join a yoga class or get one online. I can go for a walk out in nature and breathe in some fresh air. And
mhm,
it's just little things, that for people who are grieving. And I also want to bring up that we need to do this. You mentioned it when we first got on. It's like, I was really busy this weekend. I needed to take some self-care this morning, because as people who are supporting the grievers, as the grief professionals, we also have to be in touch and in tune with our emotions, and what our bodies are telling us so that we stay healthy, because we do this because we want to be of service
Right.
to others and help them, because we know that the grief can coexist with health. Grief can coexist with joy. Grief can coexist with peace and purpose. And that's really what we're about here, and sharing that at this show. So anything else that you want to add in the last 60 seconds that we have here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just want to like kind of summarize what you're saying about being a confident grief coach and working with the emotions and working with the grief and welcoming all of that. And I think for me, that's part of what makes me feel confident in my grief process is I know how to work through it, right? To move forward, not to move on, but to like just make changes and to embrace that emotional energy. And because I know that once it wells up and I allow that release and I know how to let that energy move through me and process it, that I'm not going to get stuck in it forever. And that for me is what builds a sense of confidence is like,
Mhm.
okay, I know I'm feeling this way. I need to take a time out and do some self-care so that I can work through it so that I'm not steeping in that energy and that emotion forever and ever. And then once I'm able to allow it and process it and work through it, then there's a sense of release. And then naturally I have space for the joy and the happiness and the peace and all the things that I do get to experience while I'm also grieving. So I love that you just mentioned you tied all of that together with the confidence of being a grief coach and how we teach these skills to our clients so that they can be confident navigating their grief too. Because it's not about avoiding it or getting rid of it. It's
Mm-mm.
about embracing it and moving through it so that we can keep going with our lives.
Amen. Amen, sister. And that is why Cami and I really are co-hosting this Confident Grief Coach show. And we hope that if you've got anything out of this, you got a pearl of something of how to take care of yourself, maybe how to support someone that you know that may be going through grief because someone's had a cancer diagnosis, or maybe someone recently has died because of their diagnosis, how you can help them to take care of themselves. And if you do like this show, I really encourage, both Cami and I encourage you to hit the like button and the subscribe button, because we're going to be doing a lot of these on a regular basis. So we want to hear what you have to say, if this is what's working for you, and we'll be back next week. See you later, Cami.
And see ya.
Bye bye.